On today's podcast, microdosing and the role that can play in having more energy, vitality and motivation. Do you microdose? I mean, there's a lot of talk around it in the biohacking and health and wellness world, but I don't think a lot of people do it. And that may be about to change after you listen to today's podcast.
Hi, I'm Tony. I'm an author, presenter at Sky Sports, and years ago I went to the jungle and got ill. Very ill. So this is my podcast adventure to find more energy. It's packed with biohacking, science, health tech, supplements, and some of the most well-known experts on the planet.
This is something I spent 4 months of my life doing with electrodes glued to my head so that you can do a lifetime worth of meditation.
Decide what you don't give a fuck about, which is something you don't care about.
Some of it gets quite out there.
I had some stem cells sent up to my house that I had stored, and then I injected myself with mannitol.
And we even hack hangovers.
Alcohol is poisonous. So is water and oxygen in the wrong dosage.
So that's my podcast, Zestology. Live life with energy, vitality, and motivation.
Hello again. I'm Tony, still in Thailand, strolling around in it's pretty much midday heat. I've got a wide-brimmed hat on, so I'm hot, but it's lovely conditions here. And do you know what? This podcast with Paul Austin was recorded a few months ago when I was in London, and I got quite ill in December. And I mean, to be honest, anecdotally, there is a lot of tales of people who had a sort of COVID-like chest infection in December and January and didn't quite know what it was. And that is certainly what happened to me. I didn't feel very well for a few weeks, had to rearrange this podcast with Paul, and we start off by talking about that and the role that microdosing could potentially have in improving our health and wellness. But that is the story behind why this podcast didn't come out earlier and why we had to rearrange it. And it's been interesting listening back to it in preparation for recording this introduction, because I felt so rubbish in December and I feel so good now. And it's not just the change of scenery, it's a change in attitude as well. And as I outlined on the Personal Update podcast recently, I'll be taking that change of attitude back to the UK when we go back. Soonish now. Working less, looking after myself more, and just getting out of that oversensitized state more, where every little thing acts as a bit of a trigger, and it's not sort of super stressed, it's just constantly connected. That sort of 24/7 burnout culture that can lead to you feeling really burnt out. And burnout's very much on my mind at the moment because I suffered from it a few years ago and I'm writing a book on it at the moment. I've long been interested in the role that microdosing and psychedelics could play in energy and vitality, which is why I invited Paul on the podcast. So here he is, Paul Austin on Zestology.
Paul, we're on. How are you?
Tony, I'm glad we can make this happen, and I do hope you feel better soon. There seems to be something going around. And
Yeah. We had to rearrange it because I wasn't feeling very zesty, and this podcast is all about zestology. And actually, we were just saying before we started the podcast, when you're sort of into this sort of thing and then you get ill, it's quite hard to accept. Do you find the same thing?
Well, because it's not really part of our identity, right? We pride ourselves in some ways on, we spend so much money on supplements and biohacking and whatever, you try to make yourself invincible, and then when you get sick you remember that ultimately we are not invincible. So that's how it goes, right?
Yeah, there's definitely an acceptance piece in there which I'm working on, but it is annoying. I mean, like there's all sorts of hacks and biohacks and zinc supplements that I should be taking, but none of it seems to be working.
Well, and that's part of even what we'll talk about today with microdosing and psychedelics is sort of acceptance, surrender, what role that plays even in a healing journey, whether that's healing from a cold or a cough, or whether that's healing from trauma and more than that. And so it's a nice sort of a through line with what we'll get into.
Yeah. I've always been quite interested in that. I've never felt like I'm very good at acceptance and surrender, and it's something I've worked on in the past. And as you say, especially when you're doing some deep work, that can be really helpful. And let's get into that in a sec, though. But before that, I just want to sort of introduce you to people. What is it exactly you do? And I mean, I've been delving into your work and your website's really impressive, but I just thought you could just introduce yourself.
I would say more than anything, I'm a teacher. and an educator. There's a lot of things, I would say that's at the nucleus of what I do. And then there are a lot of things that grow and emerge from that. I host a podcast myself. I run a training program for coaches and practitioners. I've written a book on microdosing, which we'll talk a little bit more about, do a lot of public speaking around it. But I would say at the core, I love learning, and I love to teach and help others learn. And then the center point of that around psychedelics is helping to sort of bridge the gap between where people are currently and sort of what science and tradition has learned about what psychedelics actually are. And there is a gap. There's a delta that needs to be closed. And so I've spent the last 7 years really doing my best to close that gap through everything that I mentioned.
Yeah. And your own interest in psychedelics and microdosing, where did that come from?
So when I was 16, I smoked cannabis for the first time, which, was kind of anathema in my community. I grew up in a fairly traditional family, quite religious, quite Christian, not conservative necessarily or fundamentalist, but certainly like sheltered, and this is good and this is bad, and morality was dictated by the Protestant tradition that I grew up in. And so when my parents found out that I'd smoked cannabis, they were quite disappointed, very disappointed. And so I sort of started to learn there that I maybe was born into a context or born into an environment that wasn't a great fit for me. And so at the age of 19, I did LSD for the first time, and I was the summer between my sophomore and junior year of university, and I did it like maybe 5 or 10 times that year. And it was just very insightful, like very profound. I came to accept who I was. I came to accept that I was different than the community and context that I grew up in. And through that process, sort of made the choice and the decision to live a very unconventional decade, going into my 20s. And so instead of doing the more typical thing, going to grad school or getting a job in a corporation, I moved to Turkey when I was 21, where I taught English. And then I proceeded to travel to 70 countries through my 20s. I started and sold my first business, which was a teaching English business. And then in 2015 was living in Chiang Mai, noticed that more people were talking about microdosing in particular, and thought, I'll try that and see how it goes. And it ended up being super impactful. And so naturally, I was like, I think more people need to know about this because I think it could help a lot of people. And so I started Third Wave as a platform to help educate people about microdosing and generally psychedelic use. My studies have been a lot in history, and so I really look at how history has repeated itself and the different flavors of history. And so I went deep then into the literature around psychedelics to understand, why are these illegal? Why are these prohibited? And then started to develop sort of a thesis and story around why these should be legal and available and accessible for those who want to utilize them, which has led me to, this podcast today, the book, Mastering Microdosing. I've started a legal psilocybin retreat center in the Netherlands. The focus has always been on cultural integration of psychedelic substances to benefit humanity.
Yeah. So, and that's really interesting you say that, because one of the things that I'm always very interested in is, well, what is a primal solution to, what can I take that is primal or mimics the way that our ancestors would have lived? And you mentioned the history of psychedelics and microdosing in particular. I'm fascinated to know what the history is and why we're in a place now where it doesn't really seem to be that sort of culturally acceptable, or certainly you can't walk down to your local newsagent and buy, microdosing in a nice, convenient tub to
Not
use.
yet. We have a nonprofit that we started where we're actively working on policy. But I think the history, as best I can communicate it in sort of a 2 to 3 minute, we've been using psilocybin mushrooms for likely 40 to 50 to 60,000 years. And it could be even longer. Terence McKenna, who's a well-known thought leader in the psychedelic space, passed away maybe 20 years ago or so. He talked about how, our ancient hominid ancestors on the savanna of Africa used psilocybin mushrooms, and that the use of psilocybin mushrooms helped to lead to a massive leap in consciousness. Specifically, it helped to expand the brain for consciousness. We also there's archaeologists that believe that the early use of psychedelics 30 or 40,000 years ago was responsible for the birth of religion, was responsible for the birth of sort of spirituality, of recognizing that there's something bigger than ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. So there's ancient use of psilocybin mushrooms in particular. Now, that is somewhat controversial. However, we have hardcore fossilized evidence of peyote. So peyote is a cacti that's in Mexico, the Jalisco region, and the indigenous people of Mexico were using peyote over 15,000 years ago as well. So we see in multiple areas, sort of geographically around the world, that there's been psychoactive plant medicine use for tens of thousands of years. And I think in addition to that, we know that ayahuasca, which many of your listeners have probably heard about at some point, it's a tea that's made in the Amazon. There's evidence that that's been used for over 1,000 years. And then we, as sort of a Western culture, if you will, there was an experience called the Eleusinian Mysteries that Plato and Aristotle participated in ancient Greece, which happened once a year. And these greater mysteries, they use something called kykeon, which is a beverage that's made from ergot, the same thing that LSD is made from. So we also have archaeological and anthropological evidence that we as a Western culture have been using psychedelics for 2,000 or 3,000 years. Now, the key with all of this, to get to your question about why is it prohibited and not sort of culturally accepted, is psychedelics have always been, for the most part, sort of an underground thing. It's been a very spiritual thing. It's been a very sort of sacred thing. And so even in the Eleusinian Mysteries, if you participated in the mysteries, you couldn't tell anyone what happened. It was highly, there were people who did tell others, and they were either killed or basically kicked out. They had to go to the islands and whatnot, which was actually worse than death in ancient Greece. Okay. And so there's always been sort of a secretive, sacred nature to it. And so the current experiment that's going on is kind of, we've never really confronted this before, where we're trying to basically legalize psychedelics for anyone to use them. Yeah. So it's a bit of an experiment. We'll see how it goes. And this is, of course, where microdosing comes in, because the whole lens of microdosing is quite new. It's just within the past 10 years that it's really become a thing. And a lot of people think about psychedelics and they think, oh, I have to take 5 grams of mushrooms, or I have to drink ayahuasca, or I have to have this ego death experience to really integrate the tangible benefits. And, the case that I've made for the last 7 years and continue to make is that actually there's a lot of tangible benefit from microdosing, and maybe that's all some people need to experience sort of the health, holistic health benefits of psychedelics.
Yeah. And I think, I've always been fascinated in microdosing, partly because in my sort of slightly wilder youth, I was never very good at the sort of drug experiences which my friends seem to take in their stride. I just terrible come downs, basically. So I've always been interested in microdosing, and maybe I didn't do it quite right. But what do we do? How can we get it right? How can we sort of benefit from this, and what can we expect to feel? Are you microdosing now?
I'm not. There are many days that I do microdose. It's 8:30 a.m. here in San Diego, so I just had some tea, and which is a psychoactive, but I haven't. I think the last time I microdosed was Saturday. I took a microdose of LSD for a beach walk, which was beautiful. But the core of microdosing is what I would call the intentional and responsible use of psychedelics. And unlike a high dose, microdose is sub-intoxicating. So you're not going to have any visuals. You're not going to really, a lot of people, I'm not recommending this, but a lot of people can navigate their everyday life. They can go to work. They can drive a car. It's quote unquote, it's not nearly as intense as doing a journey dose or a high dose. So people will say it's about a tenth of a regular dose. So with LSD, a regular dose would be 100 micrograms. A microdose is 10 micrograms. With psilocybin mushrooms, a regular dose would be maybe 2 grams, 2.5 grams. A microdose would be about 200 milligrams. So it's a tenth of a regular dose. And the idea with microdosing is that you do it consistently for a period of time. So just like when people, with meditation, it's not like you meditate once and you expect these incredible transformative benefits. You meditate every day for a month, and you kind of notice and observe what's changed in a month. Oh, I become less reactive. Oh, I become more present. Oh, I have less chatter, et cetera, et cetera. So microdosing is similar, where it's you do it 2 to 3 times a week for at least a minimum of a month. And what's happening when we're microdosing is BDNF is being regulated brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is a precursor to neuroplasticity. So our brain is becoming, our body is becoming more neuroplastic. Behavioral change becomes easier. So a lot of people will combine microdosing with a practice, right? Like, for anyone who's listening who maybe has wanted to meditate but has really found it difficult to start a meditation practice, a lot of people find that when they start microdosing, committing to a consistent meditation practice becomes way easier. So really utilizing that window of neuroplasticity over, let's say, a month, because it takes about a month to integrate a new habit, to weave in something that's going to be beneficial in the long term. It can also be a new way of eating. It could be, exercising. It could be whatever the shift is and the change is. And then after that month, to take, let's say, a week or 2 off, because we don't want to create any sort of psychological dependence. The thing about psychedelics and microdosing is it's not addictive physiologically. There's no withdrawal symptoms because of how psychedelics worked. It's actually anti-addictive. But there can be a sense of, I'm only having this experience because I'm taking this drug, this medicine. So to have a balance there is also helpful when we're starting to work with microdoses.
So you did a microdose on Saturday when you went for a walk on the beach. And I mean, it's the depths of winter here in London. I'm quite jealous of you being on the beach. But what did you get from it that you wouldn't have had without the microdose?
A great question. So I started microdosing in 2015, and I did it more in a standard protocol. So I did it twice a week, and I did it for a longer period of time, 3 months or so before I took my first significant break. And what I found in that first microdosing experience is I had 2 core intentions. One was to drink less alcohol, because I was sort of relying on alcohol to help with social anxiety. So it helped me to significantly reduce my alcohol intake and be more sort of extroverted and social. And then also to spend more time in a flow state. So I could focus better. I could
That's
write
what I
more.
want. Yeah,
exactly.
Creativity, especially. Amazing.
Creativity, yeah. So it was really helpful for that. And that's what I would recommend for anyone who's new to this, is to start with a structure, right? To utilize some sort of scaffolding. When I did it this past weekend, it's much more intuitive. I had wanted to microdose. I had the day totally off. It was like 70 and sunny, 20 to 25 centigrade and sunny, and just outside of San Diego. So I went for a long walk on the beach. And what I find is, specifically with LSD, it really helps with energy. It really helps with an uptick in mood. It really helps with a sense of just being more present. So a lot of the mind chatter just totally goes away. So I did basically a walking meditation on the beach for an hour and a half. And then I sat on some sand dunes that overlooked the beach. And I did like a sun gazing meditation as the sun was setting.
Lovely.
To sort of have that energetic. And so I think of microdosing and even high dosing as, when we're busy and we have a lot going on and we're doing everyday life, there's sort of this junk and trash that accumulates in our brain. It's why people meditate every morning. It's why people do breath work and these other things to clear that. And microdosing has a very similar effect, where it just can help clear the detritus and just sort of wipe the slate clean, so you can just feel more present, more aware, more alive again.
Yeah.
Today's podcast is brought to you by Bon Charge. I have wanted to team up with them for so long because it's such an easy sell for me. When you use a company's products, it's just very easy. And I've been on board with blue light blocking glasses ever since I was told about them. I think Luke Story told me about them about 7 or 8 years ago. And Bon Charge make beautiful blue light blocking glasses for nighttime. If you go to boncharge.com/Tony, then you can see their nighttime glasses, their daytime glasses, their computer glasses, their sunglasses, and then they've got a load of cool other stuff as well. Red light therapy, blue light blocking lighting, blackout sleep masks, EMF and radiation blocking as well, all in the name of better sleep and better health. What I think they've done is they've just sort of taken all these concepts of good health and they've said, we're going to do this properly. If you go to their site, you just know they do it properly. They ship worldwide. They ship to the US and the UK. You can use the code TONY20 for 20% off
absolutely everything. And check out the company because it's a really cool company. They're on a mission to optimize people's sleep, well-being, and recovery. But what they want to do is they use products that are science-based and rigorously tested. So go to bondcharge.com/Tony, see a big cheesy picture of me on there, and you'll also see the discount code 20% off using the code Tony20. And I do think the glasses are a bit redder than other glasses, which is brilliant. So the last hour before bed, I think it's really good to just block out all the light. I love them. Tony20, bondcharge.com/Tony. Now back to the show. I think one of the reasons that I've always been interested in it, especially at the moment, is the fact that I feel like I'm in a real sort of creative season at the moment. And there's a lot of creative stuff going on in my life, and I sort of feel quite inspired and sometimes quite surprised by what comes up. And it's really exciting. It's great. And I'd love to encourage that further and see what else I'm capable of. Because there's no doubt, as you said, it can make you feel better, it can improve your mood, all the rest of it, maybe give you more energy. There's no doubt I'll get that from various supplements, 100%. And therefore, I'm quite convinced that if I get this right, I can get it from microdosing as well.
One, and for that, then it comes down partly to the structure that you set up for yourself. So, when it comes to, let's say, accessing a flow state, there are certain things called flow triggers, right? Like basically shut down all applications, set aside, a 2-hour block of window to do creative work. For me, I love having sort of a journal where I write longhand in that journal. I may go for a walk as part of that process as well. So I think first and foremost, when we look at, let's say, the creative process, it partly comes down to what structure are you setting for yourself before you even take that microdose. Yeah. And then think of the microdose as an amplifier, right? The microdose is really going to amplify your capacity to think creatively because what it's doing neurologically, it's helping the two hemispheres of the brain to better communicate. So they've shown with some neurological scans at Imperial College in London that when we take psilocybin, but this would also apply to LSD, is the two hemispheres of the brain are communicating way better. So in many cases, high performing people are very linear. They're very sort of oriented towards getting things done, convergent thinking, right? I know I got to get X, Y, and Z done. Whereas when we take a microdose or we take psychedelics, all of a sudden this capacity to think non-linearly, this capacity to think what is called divergently, which is essentially zooming out and seeing, like the impetus of creativity and new thought and new innovation is seeing how two maybe separate ideas, two disparate ideas all of a sudden come together to form a synthesis to create something new, right? And so having that capacity to zoom out is what these lower dose psychedelics do. They showed this with research in the 60s. The same guy, Dr. Jim Fadiman, who wrote about microdosing in a book, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, he did a research trial with moderate doses of LSD in 1966. Basically, all these professionals in Silicon Valley came in. They had a problem that they had been stuck on for 3 months. He gave them a dose of LSD, and most of them came up with novel and innovative solutions that sort of stood the test of time. So I think these substances are incredible for creativity and innovation. And it's somewhat of a shame that most of the current dialogue around them is specific to healing depression, addiction, PTSD. I mean, that's necessary and helpful, certainly, but I think their biggest upside is, human evolution, the evolution of consciousness, creativity, and innovation, because we're kind of facing a point in time where we have to come up with creative solutions to challenges and problems in the existential crisis, the climate crisis, whatever. And I think psychedelics are really helpful allies in that process.
Yeah. Well, and you talk about flow state. I mean, certainly my goals, my business goals, and my personal sort of career goals are based around really more flow state than other people. That I think that's my unfair advantage. If I can get into to do more deep work than my contemporaries, I can outperform them, and that's my main goal, to do that.
And so, if that's your North Star, right, and then looking at how, because psychedelics also, when we talk about flow, time is relevant, right? Because when we are in a flow state, time is irrelevant, actually, when we're in that flow state, right? It just doesn't matter as much. And what they've shown with psychedelics, it's the same thing. And so all of a sudden, there's a capacity to condense time, whereas what what might take one person, Malcolm Gladwell has the classic 10,000 hours, 10,000 hours of practice to become a master at something. Well, utilizing flow or utilizing psychedelics, what if it took just 1,000 hours to master something rather than 10,000 hours to master something, because we're supercharging the brain's capacity to learn and adapt. And I think that is the true potential of what psychedelics can help facilitate.
Yeah. So where do you your website's very impressive. Really, really nice. What's the goal?
The goal is to legalize psychedelics is at the end of the day, right? So we've seen now, and I don't know if your audience is mostly UK based or if it's sort of...
well, it's about 50-50. Yeah.
It is. Okay.
Yeah.
So for listeners who are in the United States, Oregon legalized psilocybin in 2020. Colorado, just in a recent election a month ago, also legalized. So we now have 2 states that have legalized psilocybin. I think California will be next. Currently, MDMA, also known as ecstasy, and psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. They are both on the cusp of FDA approval. MDMA for PTSD and psilocybin for major depressive disorder and treatment-resistant depression. And then there are many cities that have decriminalized these medicines. So the focus of Third Wave is developing an educational platform that helps people to find vetted providers, a clinic to go to, a retreat center to attend, a coach to work with, a therapist to see, and then supports them in a community of people who are also believe in the potential benefit of psychedelics for humanity and want to see that happen. So I think first and foremost, from a practical, tangible way, it's how do we legalize psychedelic medicine so anyone who wants to work with this can actually access it? Because right now there are a lot of barriers because of the illegality of it. And I think second to that, then it's how could psychedelics help to transform humanity? How could it help us to create new systems for business, new systems for politics, new systems for healthcare, new systems for education? The classic psychedelic experience, what happens when people do a high dose of psilocybin or ayahuasca, is they have what's called a mystical experience.
Yeah.
So they experience what we call interconnectedness, this sense of, I'm connected to the trees, I'm connected to the earth, I am just pure energy. And so the vibration and the frequency at which I operate can be sort of upgraded, if you will, to use a slightly computer term. It can be upgraded, and in that upgrade, I can actually have more capacity to create and shift and change systems. And so I think the bigger thing is, how do I utilize psychedelics, and how do the leaders of tomorrow utilize psychedelics to sort of have this wisdom that comes through that helps to inform the new systems, the new paradigms that we create.
And just one more thing on dosing. When you buy a normal supplement and it might come in as a tincture, for example, to take 10 drops and then you're in. And that would be great if you could do that with microdosing, but that's normally not available. And it hasn't been for me when I've wanted to microdose. That'd be great, wouldn't it? But it just does. I mean, how do we do it?
So I'm glad you asked. So this is where about a year ago, we started a microdosing nonprofit called the Microdosing Collective. And the focus of the Microdosing Collective is to legalize over-the-counter microdosing supplements specific to psilocybin. And so I think the sort of clean answer is we really need to regulate this. There needs to be some sort of oversight. People need to know what they're getting, because when you just buy it on the black market or you buy it from a local guy or local gal, it's hard to know, is this what they say it is, basically. When it comes to, let's say, LSD in particular, the assumption that I often go off of is if it's bought in, a lot of times people buy LSD on blotter paper. So one dose, people will say, is usually about 100 micrograms. I would assume it's closer to 75 is what I've learned. And so titrating it that way and just making some assumptions, and it's better to go low and assume low, and then you can slightly titrate up. Because if you take too much, you can't necessarily take less, but if you don't take enough, you can always take more. Yeah. So what we tell folks is always start low and go slow. And if you're getting it, let's say on the black market with LSD, to test it, that's important. And then also, to check out our website, right? We have a mushroom grow kit, which is legal. So people can, this is for people in the United States and Canada, but they can purchase their own grow kit and grow their own mushrooms, which is quite easy. And then those who are in the UK or in the EU, it's pretty easy still to access psilocybin truffles from the Netherlands. Those have been legal there. And so there's also a possibility to access it there. And like I said, we have an entire guide on our website called it's just called a sourcing guide about how to navigate the sort of legal complexities of working with psychedelics. And so we make some more recommendations and tips there, which we can link to in the show notes or whatever.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, we'll point people that way. So obviously the questions that I ask everybody, what is one book that you would recommend and one tip for living with more energy? I'm very interested that you mentioned energy with regard to microdosing. What's the book and the tip then?
Well, I think the book as a natural lead-in is Mastering Microdosing, How to Use Subperceptual Psychedelics to Heal Trauma, Improve Performance, and Transform Your Life. It's a book that I just published about a month ago that I've been working on for the better part of 5 years. And so that's really the center point. If anyone is interested in learning more about microdosing, they want to learn about the science, the research, the various use cases, how it can be used for flow and creativity.
Congratulations. So that just came out recently, did it?
Yeah, it just came out about a month ago, November 15th. So I would say that's the book that I would recommend based on this talk. And then for more energy, there's a lot of, I'll get a little philosophical. There's a lot of energy that's stuck in the shadow, right? That's stuck in the emotions that we repress. And so what microdosing and what mini dosing and what even high doses of psychedelics do is they actually open up the capacity to access the subconscious and the unconscious. They allow us to access the emotion that we've repressed. And by allowing us to access that, it actually, it makes us healthier. It makes us more energetic. It allows us to have a better mood because we're taking things that are sort of stuck or buried and bringing them to the surface. So I think my tip for increasing energy would be to do shadow work, to look into the unknown, to look in the stuff that we've repressed, and to utilize psychedelics as a helpful tool in that process, whether it's microdosing or a high dose. What psychedelics are really, really, really good at is allowing us to access emotions and stories that we've repressed. And by bringing those to the surface, people find that they have a lot more energy and, on an everyday sort of existence.
Yeah. No, I mean, listen, honestly, I really agree. My background is NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, and I've just been writing a book on using the skills of NLP. And I sort of wrote one breakout box, which really just said, look, all of this stuff is great, but I have found some of the biggest changes in my life didn't come from NLP, but really deep psychotherapy and introspection that allowed me to shine a light on some of the things that were just holding me back. And it was too deep for even NLP there. But it sort of gets at the same thing. And, in our world, there's a lot of biohackers who listen to this podcast. And sometimes it's not the new supplement that's going to help. It's just some real deep work.
Yeah, it's those ancient practices that we've sort of lost in modern culture that allow us to actually access this, what Jung called the collective unconscious. And it can be difficult work. It's not necessarily pretty and well put together, but it is necessary for further development. Oftentimes, what's blocking us is in the shadow.
Yeah, Paul, it's been really great to chat. Where can people find out more about you and the book as well?
So the book, Mastering Microdosing, it's on Amazon. Third Wave, thethirdwave.co. We have a newsletter that we send out every week. So subscribe to that. Check out the podcast. And then I'm on Instagram and Twitter at PaulAustin3W. And just send me a note, reach out if you're listening to this and you have any questions about anything that we talked about today.
All right. Thanks, Paul. Great to talk to you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tony.
That is it. Thank you for listening to Zestology. Thank you to Paul for coming on. I am getting plenty of natural sunlight here, but if you are not lucky enough to be in a hot place like I am at the moment, then you might want to choose an infrared light from somewhere like Bon Charge, who sell all sorts of biohacking supplements and goodies, or some of their blue blocking glasses. Or if you check my Instagram, which is at Tony Wrighton, you can see my blue blocked lights that I have been talking about on this podcast. You charge them up through just a USB port, and then you can just carry them around the place. It is like walking around with fire in the house and not setting the house on fire. It's very nice. If you go to boncharge.com/Tony, you can find the lights and the infrared light and everything else. And I've been listening to Andrew Huberman's podcast on the actual effects of infrared light and red light. I mean, it's incredible what happens with our eyes. and our skin as well, and how infrared light actually sort of just very, very gently helps the stem cells under the sort of highest level of the skin rejuvenate themselves. It's and all completely proven by science. So go to bondcharge.com/Tony. They've also got loads of science on their site as well. It's an all-round resource for the type of person who listens to this podcast, and I'm very, very happy and grateful to have a podcast partner that can just help keep the lights on at Zestology. As I've said before, my podcast partners, it's not a huge profit-making venture doing this podcast, but it's a lot of fun, and it's nice to sort of have the basics paid for. And perhaps I should be saying, rather than keep the lights on, keep the infrared lights on. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.